The iron girder buckled beneath my boots, and for 3 endless seconds, there was nothing between my chest and the black churning current of the Spree, but 15 feet of empty air. Tracers from an MG-42 snapped inches past my ears, striking the severed bridge span in screaming ricochets that showered my face with white-hot sparks. The air tasted of sulfur, pulverized lime, and burning river mud. Behind me, the center arch of the Moltke Bridge had already collapsed into the water, blown to pieces by demolition charges that tore the granite roadbed into jagged fangs. I held my breath, gripping the hot receiver of my PPS submachine gun as the concussion of 88mm shells threw geysers of freezing spray across the iron. My fingers were locked in terror. My boots were slipping on the wet, blood-slick flange. Across the water, the fortress walls of the Ministry of the Interior loomed through the sulfuric fog, spitting muzzle flashes from every ground floor window. There was nowhere to retreat. The bridge behind us was gone. I didn't know it yet, but that desperate sprint across the severed span was only the beginning of what Berlin would demand from us. The smoke hung so thick over the freight yard that breathing felt like swallowing dry sand. Every breath of air scraped against the back of my throat, tasting of pulverized plaster, burnt rubber, and sulfur. I pressed my back against the shattered brick pillar of the Lehrter railway station, feeling the heavy vibration of Soviet heavy artillery miles behind us, shuddering straight up through the soles of my Kirza boots. Beyond the collapsed iron roof of the terminal lay the river Spree, and spanning that black, oily water was the only path left to the heart of the city, the Moltke Bridge. 3 stone arches spanned the dark current, but it looked less like a bridge and more like a slaughterhouse chute. The Germans had driven streetcar rails vertically into the stone roadbed and laced them with dense coils of concertina wire. Across the river, rising into the burning night sky, like a gray mountain of fortress stone, stood the Ministry of the Interior, the vast building we had all learned to call Himmler's house. "Look at the masonry on the center pier," Viktor Belov whispered beside me. He reached up with a soot-stained sleeve and adjusted the leather chin strap of his SSH-40 helmet, a nervous habit that kept his fingers moving whenever the artillery paused. Viktor was 21, a carpenter from the river docks of Vologda who had spent his youth bending oak ribs for freight barges on the Sukona. "If the timber held against the Sukona flood, the iron will hold against the fire," Viktor said quietly, his voice trembling just enough to betray the calm words. "Wood floats, Vitya," I told him, checking the drum magazine on my PPS-41. "Stone and iron just drag you straight to the mud." I felt inside the breast pocket of my quilted tehla, gray ka jacket. My fingers brushed the smooth 3-inch cherrywood spindle my sister had given me when I left the textile mills of Ivanovo. For 3 years, that little piece of polished wood had been my compass. In Ivanovo, 400 mechanical looms slammed back and forth in perfect, deafening unison. You learn to measure your life by the mechanical clack of the shuttles. Out here, in the ruins of Berlin, the rhythm was dictated by the hammer stroke of German machine guns. Junior Sergeant Lev Guriev crawled up through the rubble, coughing hard into his sleeve. His face was gray with brick dust, his eyes red and swollen from the acid smoke of burning electrical cables. Lyova was 24, an oil technician from Baku who had spent years around high-pressure drills. "They did not just barricade the road," Lyova rasped, rolling a pinch of coarse Makhorka tobacco inside a scrap of technical railway manual with shaking hands. "Look through the glass. Under the second arch, the demolition cables are already strung along the stone pilings." I squinted through the sulfuric haze. Thin black ignition wires ran like spiderwebs along the ornamental stone balustrade, disappearing under the central arch. Heavy wooden crates wrapped in tarred canvas were strapped directly to the load-bearing keystones. "They are waiting for our assault wave to reach the center span," Lehrter muttered, lighting the edge of the paper with a cupped match. "Where there is a spark, the air burns faster than lead. The moment we step onto that stone, they will blow the whole structure into the Spree." Down on the northern approach, 2 platoons from our 756th Regiment were already gathering behind the stone embankments. Young recruits from the replacement drafts huddled with their knees tucked to their chests, their fuses rattling against their steel mess kits. A few yards to my left, a 19-year-old replacement threw Mason Nagant rifle, his fingers shaking so violently that he could not seat the stripper clip. In my rush to clear the doorway and lock my drum magazine, I shoved him roughly aside, knocking his cartridge pouch into the rubble. The boy looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, and a sharp sting of shame hit my chest before I could look away. "First squad moves on the whistle," Captain Neustroev's voice echoed down the stone corridor. The air suddenly turned freezing cold as the wind whipped off the dark water. High above the river, green and red tracer fire stitched across the sky from the flak towers in the Tiergarten, reflecting on the oily ripples of the Spree below. None of us knew that 500 yards out in the dark, 3 concealed 88mm guns were already zeroed on the bridge's northern entryway. Victor gripped my shoulder, his knuckles white against my dirty sleeve. "Stay low on the iron girders, Danya," he whispered. "Do not look down at the water." The whistle blew, a single, piercing shriek that cut clean through the thunder of the guns. We surged out from the arches of the railway station like water bursting through a cracked dam. The instant my boots hit the granite pavers of the bridge approach, the night erupted in white blinding flame. 2 MG-42 machine guns opened up simultaneously from the ground floor casemates of Himmler's house across the river. The sound was not a sequence of individual shots, but a tearing roar, like heavy canvas ripping in a hurricane. Tracers ricocheted off the streetcar tracks in screaming blue arcs, showering the stone roadway with white-hot sparks. "Down! Get behind the stone parapet!" I yelled, throwing my weight against the ornate sandstone balustrade. Beside me, the stone face of a Prussian eagle statue shattered into jagged slivers under a direct 20mm strike. A sharp shard of sandstone tore across my cheek, warm blood mixing with the cold paste of lime dust on my skin. I watched the muzzle, flashes across the dark water. The German gunners fired in tight, disciplined 4-second bursts, followed by a 3-second silence as the loader swapped belts. It was mechanical and precise, exactly like the heavy looms in Ivanovo slamming home a new row of warp threads before reversing. In those 3 seconds of silence, a man could cover 12 yards of broken stone if his boots did not slip on the blood-slick granite. "Follow my pace," I shouted to Victor. "Count the gaps between the bursts." Victor scrambled forward on his belly, his Mosin rifle clutched tightly across his chest. He reached up, his soot-caked fingers catching the leather chin strap that had slipped loose on his chin again, tightening the buckle until the strap bit into his jawline. "I see the cable," Lehrter called out from behind a pile of crushed masonry 6 paces back. "The lead wire is smoking. They have lit the primer under the center span." A thick, acrid smell of burning sulfur and pitch began to drift up between the roadbed cracks. Ahead of us, 40 yards into the bridge, an overturned postal truck lay on its side, riddled with bullet holes. It was the only cover before the center pier. "Move!" I barked. We sprinted low through the firestorm. The heavy thud of 88mm high-explosive shells was dropping into the Spree 50 yards downstream, sending geysers of black river water crashing over the iron railings. The cold spray drenched my quilted jacket, adding pounds of freezing weight to my shoulders. We threw ourselves behind the rusted iron chassis of the postal truck. Victor was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, his lips blue against the pale skin of his face. "My cartridge pouch is jammed with grit," he gasped, his fingers fumbling blindly with the brass latch of his ammunition box. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the smooth cherrywood spindle, and used its hard tapered point to pry the jammed latch free from the packed brick dust. The metal popped open. I shoved 3 stripper clips into his trembling hand. "Keep your head down, Vitya," I told him, our eyes locking for a second through the drifting cordite smoke. "If the timber held against the Sukona flood, the iron will hold against the fire," he repeated, but this time his voice was a dry, hollow rattle. Across the water, the firing from Himmler's house abruptly ceased. A terrifying, unnatural silence fell over the river. For 5 seconds, the only sound was the crackle of distant fires in Mitte and the heavy lap of river water against the stone piers. Why did they stop? Victor whispered. That silence was our answer. Deep beneath our feet, the stone roadbed groaned. A blinding flash of yellow light erupted from the center of the bridge, followed instantly by a shockwave so violent that it lifted the postal truck 4 inches off the granite. The German engineers had detonated the main demolition charges. The entire middle section of the Moltke Bridge buckled skyward. Massive blocks of masonry, torn iron railings, and slabs of roadbed were flung into the air and crashed down into the boiling Spree. The center arch collapsed in a thunderous roar, leaving a gaping 20-foot crater of jagged iron girders and sheared stone hanging over the black water. The blast threw me backward onto the stone paving. Concussion pounded against my ears like a sledgehammer, driving all sound into a high-pitched ringing hum. When the dust cleared enough to see, Victor was lying 5 feet away at the lip of the crater, his helmet gone, staring up into the smoking sky as blood soaked the wool of his torn collar. I dragged myself across the pulverized stone, my hands tearing on jagged shards of steel reinforcement wire. Smoke poured from the crater in black, greasy coils, smelling of high explosive and scorched mud. "Vitya!" I yelled, but my own voice sounded muffled and distant through the ringing in my ears. I reached him at the edge of the drop. The center arch had dropped into the river, but by some miracle of Prussian ironwork, a single heavy steel girder still spanned the 20-foot gap between the severed ends of the roadbed. It hung twisted and blackened over the dark current 10 feet below. Victor's face was chalk white under the soot. A jagged chunk of stone had struck his chest, tearing through his tunic and cracking his collarbone. His breathing came in shallow, wheezing rattles. "Danya," he whispered, his eyes unfocused as he looked toward the far bank. And the girder, it held. "Hold on to me," I told him, hooking my arm under his shoulder to drag him behind the protection of a shattered stone pier. "The medical squad is right behind the second wave." "No," Victor gasped. His trembling fingers reached into his canvas bag, pulled out a full drum magazine for my PPS, and pressed the heavy steel cylinder into my chest. His fingers gripped my sleeve with one last surge of strength. "Danya, tell her, I saw the..." His voice trailed off into the wind. His hand went slack, his fingers slipping from my coat. Behind us, Victor's SSH-40 helmet rolled slowly across the canted stone roadbed, its torn leather chin strap trailing through the gray dust, coming to rest at the edge of the crater. His canvas field bag slipped over the broken parapet and vanished into the black swirling current of the Spree below. I did not stop to close his eyes. On the Moltke Bridge, stopping meant dying. I locked Victor's drum into the receiver of my pouprièche, chambered around, and stepped out onto the narrow blackened flange of the exposed steel girder. From the first-floor windows of Himmler's house, an MG-42 opened fire. Bullets struck the iron beam between my boots, sending blinding showers of sparks into my face. The river rushed below, black and cold, churning with floating timbers and the wreckage of our assault boats. I did not look down. I fixed my eyes on the jagged breach in the southern masonry and sprinted across the void. 20 feet of bare iron, 6 strides through open air and whistling steel. I leaped from the girder, hit the shattered granite on the southern bank, and rolled hard into the brick-strewn courtyard of the ministry. Behind me, Lehrter and a dozen fusiliers from the 756th Regiment vaulted across the gap, firing their submachine guns in continuous, deafening bursts into the smoking ground floor windows. We breached the heavy oak doors of the ministry with a volley of F1 fragmentation grenades. The blast blew the doors inward in a blizzard of wood splinters and plaster dust. Inside, the grand hallways of the Reich Ministry of the Interior were reduced to cavernous stone tombs, choked with rubble and suffocating gray fog. In the corner of the shattered entry hall, beneath a collapsed marble staircase, lay a German defender. He was barely 18 years old, wearing an oversized Luftwaffe greatcoat with the shoulder boards torn away. His eyes were wide and unseeing in the dim light of the burning corridor. Spilled beside his limp hand on the bloody floor was a small wooden matchbox. Inside, neatly wound around tiny cardboard notches, were 3 small spools of gray mending thread and a steel tailor's needle from Dresden. I knelt in the dust, staring at the little spool of thread. He was a weaver's boy, or an apprentice tailor, sent with a rifle into the rubble to die in the path of an advancing army. I stood up slowly and walked back out onto the south parapet of the Moltke Bridge. Dawn was breaking over Berlin on the 29th of April. The sky was not blue, but a dull, bruised slate gray, streaked with amber smoke, rising from the burning ruins of the Reichstag 500 yards to the south. The guns had finally fallen silent on the bridge, leaving only the slow, rhythmic sound of the Spree washing against the broken stone piers. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the cherry wood spindle from Ivanovo, and looked at its blackened, splintered tip. The wood was cold in my palm. Years later, in 1983, I would sit by the window of the Ivanovo textile mill as the afternoon shift ended. Through the glass, hundreds of mechanical looms kept slamming their shuttles back and forth in perfect, endless rhythm. But whenever I looked at that little scarred wooden spindle on my workbench, I never heard the sound of weaving. I only heard the tearing roar of machine guns across the Spree and the silence of the men who never crossed the Moltke Bridge.